So this weekend in our national history is a recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day. And today we're going to be looking at what that means historically and for us today, and a look also at the rise of, or the reoccurrence of, some of the aspects of our most problematic violence in our history and how that's reoccurring today, or is a threat to it, of reoccurring. And what our role as people is in a community, a religious community, to stave off those excesses and also to own or understand more deeply our own internal sense of where has this been in our lives, or where in our lives have we not maybe done what we could do. But I want to begin, and I'll circle around back to Indigenous Peoples Day, to a scriptural story that's found in Judaism and Christianity and Islam that I think is a good lens to help us understand these cycles. And it's one of the harder stories I've wrestled with in scriptures. It's the story of Cain and Abel, one of our oldest stories. They were the first children of Adam and Eve. I'm sorry, I'm getting used to reading glasses, and so I've not quite figured out the right angle yet, so I'm going to just do my best. It's another practice in our religious community of offering me grace. Thank you. Cain was a farmer and worked the earth. Abel was a shepherd. When it came down to them, some of you have experienced this before. I've recently upgraded to font 14, and now I think I need to go up to 16, so I'm in that club right now. Cain was a farmer and worked the earth, and Abel was a shepherd. When it came for them to offer gifts in sacrifice to the Lord, they gave him in turn a portion of their work. God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice of fat of the first of his flock, but was not moved by Cain's gift of the fruit of the earth. Angered by being treated differently, Cain murdered his brother Abel. And when God came to question where Abel was, Cain responded famously, "What, am I my brother's keeper?" Cain would be cursed to wander the roads and leave the lands of his family for his sin. It's a hard story. Was God unfair in what pleased him? Could he be so flippant in his regard for his own children that one would be driven to murder? I think some of the story is lost to our modern ear. This is not the world that those of us in this room live in anymore. Farming would allow civilization to thrive, with more and more people being able to live stably near one another. But meat would continue to be more prized. I think to an earlier time in our history, the difference in what sacrifices were made might be more readily understood than we get it today. Each of the brothers may have worked as hard as one another, but one sacrificed more, and the other was jealous for not receiving the same benefits, even though he may have given up less. The story even has God tell Cain that he shouldn't be angry, for if he works harder, he will be rewarded. What's lost in such a simple statement is that Cain probably already felt like he had worked hard, but he can't get into his brother's shoes, so he doesn't appreciate that Abel is also diligent in his duties. And then it comes to the murder. Am I my brother's keeper? You hear a version of this in the news every week these past 5 years. Am I my brother's keeper? It's probably the oldest story, claiming no responsibility for the welfare of our neighbor as a defense, when in fact we've actively contributed to their ruin. Or in Cain's case, the extreme murder. The Cain and Abel story is near the start of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scriptures. Although with slight derivations for each, at the start of scripture, we learn clearly that yes, we are our siblings' keepers. We are entrusted with securing the well-being of our neighbor. It's central to the spiritual teachings of each of the Abrahamic faiths. Everything else builds upon that foundation. Cain, in modern language, could be the poster boy these days for white nationalism, Christian nationalism, our Nazi history. They might feel that they haven't been given a fair shake, but they can't get into the shoes of their neighbors. Instead of reaching out, caring for their neighbor, they instead seek to end the competition. We see this in the rapid spreading of, in our country, for-profit prisons, which are especially thriving these days. We see this in gerrymandered districts that lead to disparate quality in education of schools, or access to voting benefiting whites and the affluent above all others. It's plain as day. We see it in how public protests are too often treated. As recently as Charleston, Nazis with semi-automatic weapons were allowed to police themselves, in Charlottesville, whereas Native Americans protesting their own pipelines, being put in their own lands, were hit with freezing water and fire hoses. And we have coming up this week, our own Senior Minister, Reverend Peggy Clark, is going to be protesting again against the pipeline in support of the Indigenous Peoples Agency on their own lands. The white supremacists are right that we're not all treated fairly. They just don't understand how much has already been stacked in their favor. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sibling's keeper? There's a blog post that makes the rounds from time to time relating all of this to game theory, so to speak. It's an overgeneralization, but it does prove a point. So it's far from perfect. But maybe it would help some of us see where it's getting at. I'm a big, for those of you who don't know, I'm a sci-fi and a gamer geek. So this kind of imagery works really well for me. Being a white, cisgender, straight man is like playing a video game on the easiest setting. It doesn't mean that you don't have to still play the game well, or it doesn't mean it doesn't take effort, or that you won't fail at times and have to try again and again. It could still be quite hard, but everyone else is playing on a harder setting in some way, shape, or form. The tricky part is realizing that when you're on an easier setting, even when it's hard, others probably have it harder. And I don't mean this in some kind of hierarchy oppression. It's an image that's meant to just say that things can be difficult and other people have it harder. And it's part of that self-reflection that helps us nurture our own sense of wisdom and an agency in building equity in the world. It begins with our own selves. I'll give you an example in my own life. When I began in the ministry 16 years ago, I was working in religious education. It wasn't too long before I started realizing that a good number of people would feel quite fine speaking to me with what I considered a patronizing tone. I was in my mid-30s, early 30s, mid-30s, and I didn't recall anyone ever speaking to me that way, at least since my early college days. It felt infantilizing in a way. After talking to a few colleagues who were women, and this is not going to be a surprise to the women in the room, I'm sure, I started to realize that some of us were accustomed to speaking to women this way all the time. And I was doing what was so-called women's work, working with children in education. And people were unconsciously treating me the way they treated women all the time. Now, I earned my way into the ministry. 2 graduate degrees. I paid my way through school, and I'm still paying that debt 17 years later. Spent countless hours in internships, 400 hours doing chaplaincy work at a Columbia Presbyterian's pediatric ICU. Heartbreaking. And so on and so on. And this is my calling, and this didn't come easy. But until experiencing a sliver of what women deal with all too often, I didn't personally or fully understand how having that leg up being a guy changed the proverbial video game setting to easy. And to the fellow guys in the room, intellectually getting that women are treated differently too often is different than experiencing it, even in the small way I was experiencing it. There's an emotional part that is demoralizing in ways that we're not necessarily accustomed to. And I can say most of us are not trained or raised to cope with. Some of us are trained and raised to cope with it. I wasn't. The more we diminish those we choose to feel as different, the more that peace is at risk. And every one of these stories leads into this. And I'm trying to back into the harder conversations by lifting up some of the everyday things we all sort of get. In Western civilization, the roots of such discord runs deep. If we teach our kids that the history of the world is cleaner than it's been, today's language, you could say critical race theory is not going to be taught in schools, right? Then we're more innocent than we are. We teach ourselves to believe we're more innocent than we are, and that everything can be simplified into good guys and bad guys. You're for us or you're against us. Remember that? History will repeat itself until the very literal end of days. We need to foster a new kind of courage, the courage to self-reflect with honesty. There's an easy escape for us when we start to talk about our history. It's the common philosophy that haters gonna hate, to quote the great theologian Taylor Swift. We ease our guilt by believing that some people are just filled with hate in their hearts. And we're helpless to change that. And to be sure, there are folks all over the globe that are likewise convinced that we're all just filled with hate in our hearts. How could drone strikes on civilian targets ever be done by an unhateful people? And that's the world that we live into. It's complicated, it's tragic. And if we don't figure out self-reflective ways to live into nuance, we are going to keep these cycles of harm. There's some lies that get free rent in our head, bad ethics that remain alive in our worldview because we forget they were ever there, let alone informing our values and perceptions. I'm going to talk about two of them now and ask us to reflect on how they still impact our lives today. The courage to reflect honestly is the next movement we can make to head toward a world that chooses to center peace as a value, building the beloved community, the words we say every week. The first is eminently crucial to our work honoring Indigenous Peoples Day this weekend. Manifest Destiny first entered our U.S. conscience, and conscience, I guess, both work for different reasons, in 1845, when a newspaper writer by the name of O'Sullivan coined it in response to a border dispute with Britain over what is now known as Oregon. And the quote goes, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us." It's talking about continued genocide. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to James Monroe, wrote, and I quote, "It is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern, continent." Could you imagine, if his wish came true, what that would mean? The 19th century U.S. would be colored by this deadly ethic. In the name of our special American virtues, we would clear ourselves of the sin and the horror of genocide. The thinking went that it was our divine fate, so we ought to expand without limit, regardless of the consequences. It's a classic fallacy that the ends justify the means. We diminish those we choose to feel as different, and peace is at risk. We center greed, which is what we did, for those of us that were here at the time, and the world expands its weaponry, cycle after cycle. The idea of manifest destiny came about over a land dispute between two colonizing powers over who had the right to claim stolen lands of people we murdered, the US. But we would tell a different story. One famous piece of art depicts the manifest destiny as a beautiful woman in a white flowing gown, floating in the air, inspiring the western expansion of American farmers, peaceful, virtuous, and prosperous. Think back to my own personal story a minute ago about how women and gender is used to normalize certain toxic and dangerous behaviors, and it takes on a new light when it becomes propaganda. That's the story we would tell instead of the honest one. When we couch what is ugly in terms of beauty, we empower brutality. All of us now would overtly condemn Manifest Destiny as a failure, I think, of a prior generation, but we repeat it still to this day. It wasn't but a few years ago that our militarized police showed up in force to Native Americans peacefully protesting that oil pipeline on their own land. And Manifest Destiny, or the doctrine of discovery that I'll talk about in a little bit, is still ensconced in our Supreme Court as the law of the land. All of it completely legal, freezing water by hose. Why as a nation would we not unanimously retract in horror at that abuse? It's the unreflected lie that remains hidden in our collective psyche. Some of us are horrified by it, and some of us can't accept it because it would mean we get to look inward and realize that the video game settings might be different for all of us. That second hidden lie that informs our ethic is similar, but goes back further in our history. Unlike Manifest Destiny, the lie is formally sanctioned in our precedents, as I was just mentioning, the doctrine of discovery. European monarchies would use it to validate conquest outside of Europe. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas would say that this only applied to non-Christian lands. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Johnson versus McIntosh that the discovery rights of European sovereigns had been transferred to the new United States. So we fought a revolution over representation locally, and then took all the things that were twisted and applied it to the people that we were stealing and killing from. And even in our Unitarian history, our history's not good with this. So Associate Justice Joseph Story, a Unitarian, he lived from 1779 to 1845, that time period, later wrote, "As infidels, heathens, and savages, they, the Indians, were not allowed to possess the prerogatives belonging to absolute, sovereign, and independent nations." I know we often like to think of ourselves as having a really clean history, and some of our folks were part of the problem at the top. I'm not sure how we ever go back now. I don't know, and that's not the focus today. But let's sit with this reality for a moment. We have ensconced in the highest court of our land that justice doesn't mean justice. That's always dangerous, right? And as recently as 2016, we're aiming water hoses again. We've been speaking a lot over this past 6 months, and maybe Reverend Peggy has been speaking about it before during the full Zoom time before I got here, about how small actions can lead to big change. Violence, war, militarization are huge crises. It's mostly true to say that we individually can't impact this, and not quickly. The next small thing for us all to do is to strive toward putting on a new pair of glasses when we look out into the world, when we read the news, when we talk with extended family over awkward holiday meals. And surely we're coming back around once more to this 'tis the season. I remember a time when I just avoided every kind of political conversation with my family, and then it became really clear that that was a failing move, that some folks were being further and further indoctrinated, and then my silence was allowing that to happen. And so maybe part of what we're doing is, in the world around us, help bringing people back bit by bit. I'll share these words from Reverend Jake Morrill, another UU minister down south. He's retired now and is coaching. He was saying this specifically to a group of white UU ministers as a challenge to lean into our privilege, specifically white men. But it's a helpful meditation focus for this sermon and this time of centering. He writes, "Do you know how the Copernican revolution was the insight that the earth revolved around the sun and that we're not the center of the universe? Well, a few decades later, Giordano Bruno postulated the universe in which the solar system was not at the center of the universe either, but instead existed amidst many galaxies, beyond imagination. So the idea is that, in this case, we white men, who have been raised to imagine ourselves at the center of everything, might begin to inhabit a world in which we are only one perspective, spinning around many other centers. Peace will not prevail if we continue to all imagine we're each individually the center of the universe." And that's one of the big struggles, I think, in our national debates around how are we our siblings' keeper. And centering ego over community is that siren call of white supremacy. We often think of supremacists as white arrogance, and it's that too for sure. White supremacists are also sexist. They're homophobes. But their flashpoint these days seem to be race. In our everyday world, through the news, Facebook, if you're on it, in our schools, we all learn a lot about race. I mean, that's one of the big national arguments right now. What do we teach? From some people, we learn that everything is fair and balanced, and that if only you work hard enough, then you'll be given a fair chance at success and happiness. In that story, class is the dividing line, and that is often a more comfortable dividing line than talking about the dynamics around race. And I mention this today because Indigenous Peoples Day, we have seen the worst excesses of what this means in our history, genocide. So it's core, it's crucial to have the uncomfortable conversations now before we slide any closer to that again. Our UU values teach us to live out a responsible search for truth and meaning. We covenant to affirm and promote the responsible search, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And the long-standing quip, and it's a struggle in our denomination now between different groups using this principle and work around anti-racism. Some focus on free search and some focus on responsible search. And it's both. We need to be responsible to one another. I'm a child of the 80s, white, gay, and from a working class background. My dad was in the Navy with a high school degree, and my mom got her GED in her 20s after she dropped out of high school when she was 16 to help my grandma with her brother. I was the first generation in our family to go to college, let alone graduate school twice. It would be easy to say that everything is fair and balanced. I did it. I worked hard. I succeeded in education and my career, where I am now. It's great. The economic class I was born in didn't hold me back. Mine is the kind of story that's often lifted up to say anyone can make it. But it's only part of the picture. I grew up in an African-American neighborhood in Central Jersey. I was the only white kid in my neighborhood. All my friends were black and my age or a couple years older. And I moved away from my parents at 19, and I would come back and catch up with friends from childhood and hear stories from neighbors how folks were doing. By the time I went to graduate school at the age of 28, only one of my childhood peers from my section of town had attended higher education. Some were in and out of unemployment. Others had good blue-collar jobs like being auto mechanics. So many of them had the same grade point average I did. Some were still living with their parents, besides my one neighbor who went on to law school, but who had to drop out to care for her dying mother. I heard no stories of folks attending a four-year college. She eventually had a good career as a teacher, and something was different. These were all smart, capable friends, my peers. I felt different in a way that I hadn't felt as a child. I think it's important to consider how our identities shape and impact our lives. Class and gender and sexuality each intersect in important ways with race, but I've seen firsthand how much easier I had it, even when it was very hard. It's never been easy. It's always taken a lot of work, and other folks that put the same amount of work in didn't land in the same places. Something was different. And I think as just like manifest destiny is a lie we told that has caused harm, we have to interrogate the idea of the American dream and what it means for everybody today. I've shared these two personal stories because too often our conversations about racism are either in the abstract or the extreme. We get into a debate rather than having an emotional conversation. Some of us pretend that all of it is in our distant past: genocide, slave trade, the Holocaust. Even as we see now the rise of right-wing extremism in Europe, and we're just trying to push back on that here in the States. But it's harder to acknowledge how we benefit from the inequity for those of us that benefit. We are each our neighbor's keepers, and too often we turn away from those hard truths that we might be asked to honor, that we're getting too much sometimes, the Cain and Abel story, or that our hard work, even though it was hard, was held at a different standard. This is the central work of our time: to speak truth to hate, to limit the damage caused by the worst of us, to self-reflect on what we need to unpack in our own lives, that's never ending, and to inspect our own internal motivations. As Maya Angelou said, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. I'm going to believe someone claiming, as we've seen all these past 5 years, claiming they're a supremacist, claiming they're a Proud Boy, claiming they're a Nazi. Some are openly saying that. I mean, we've seen torches in our streets. Believe them and not think that we need to downplay that. It is what it is. Call sin a sin. I know that word is uncomfortable to some of us, and in this case, it's probably the only time it really fully applies. In closing, as our grandparents have the duty now to tell and retell the old stories, the people that remember what it was like 50 years ago, or 80 years ago, or longer, to, so to speak, vaccinate our children, our next generation, from these evils. I encourage our parents to speak with our children, our grandparents to speak with their grandchildren, make sure they understand the threats and the risks. They will also mimic your thinking. If you find yourself edging away from engaging any of this, they might too, and we need folks to engage. If you find yourself avoiding ever talking about all of this or shifting it back to class as if that's the only thing it is, they might be more vulnerable too to the extremism that we're seeing in our nation. We all need to learn and understand that although economics are not fair for all, racism is alive and well. They need to know that prior to the rise of fascism in Europe, the Nazis were a fringe movement before they weren't. We all need to know that torches in those streets, what they meant in Germany and what they mean here when they happen here. What we see is a riot on the Capitol, an insurrection. It took 6 months for someone to actually call it that. And if we're going to believe someone when they tell us or show us who they are the first time, we need to prepare our next generation to know fully the lessons of our forebears, what they learned in the most horrid way imaginable. We might not be able to fix it, but we can do our part in preparing the next generation and this generation. Decent Americans are the vast majority, and we must remain vigilant, loud and clear in denouncement of the worst excesses of hate, inhumanity, which is perennially has to offer. Our oldest story teaches us that we are our siblings' keeper. We are responsible for the well-being of our neighbor, and any other teaching is false according to the Jewish scripture, the Christian scripture, Muslim scriptures. So it is to all of us then to help us back on the right path that honors liberty alongside justice. It's a way of saying accountability too. We open our service with the land acknowledgement to remind us of our commitments. These words we've shared today is how we can live the next move into them. Amen, and blessed be